Hidden behind steel doors lie the greatest stories the auto world forgot. From factory wars to near-death legends, this is Vaulted Wheels, unlocking the machines that built America.
Picture this. The Cold War is officially over. It's the mid-1990s. The dust has finally settled on the fallen Soviet Union, and the team of American armor engineers has just taken delivery of a massive, retired Soviet luxury vehicle. Now, on the outside, it just looks like this blocky, outdated relic of communist excess. But they didn't buy it for the looks. They bought this car specifically to tear it apart and reverse engineer its capabilities. And what they were about to find buried deep inside that metal would completely rewrite everything they thought they knew about VIP protection. Okay, let's dive into this. Because when these American engineers actually tore the car's body panels off, they were completely stunned. I mean, they were looking for the standard security techniques of the era, right? Kevlar panels tucked inside the doors, maybe some reinforced plating welded to the frame. But instead, they discovered an engineering philosophy that just flipped everything the West knew completely upside down. Because what they uncovered wasn't just a luxury car that had some heavy armor bolted onto it, no way. It was a brilliantly engineered, self-supporting military vault that literally had a luxury car built around it. It was incredibly rigid, possessed an insanely low center of gravity, and because of that, it was virtually unflippable. They were looking at the legendary Soviet ZIL. But to really grasp how wild this engineering is, we first have to talk about the massive paradox of Soviet ideology. Officially, the state championed equality for all, right? They absolutely rejected Western capitalist luxury. Yet, the reality on the ground was entirely different. The state was pouring massive funds into creating these ultra-exclusive, hand-built V8 limousines that were strictly reserved for the absolute top of the pull-up row elite. Why? It was all about geopolitical theater. When a Soviet leader arrived at a high-stakes summit in Geneva or Washington, they couldn't just pull up in some basic mass-market compact car. They needed to project global power on par with the American president's Cadillac or the British Rolls-Royce. And you couldn't just walk into a dealership and buy one of these things, no matter how much money you had. Access was dictated entirely by the state. If we look at the ZIL-41047 model that was introduced in 1985, only 234 of those were ever hand-built. That averages out to fewer than 10 cars a year. They were the ultimate, undeniable marker of power, heavily guarded and operated by a highly classified unit known as the Special Purpose Garage, or GON. Now, what's really interesting here is the bizarre luxury logic the Soviets applied to the interior. The chauffeur's front cabin was upholstered in this tough, durable black leather. But the rear passenger compartment, that was finished in incredibly plush wool velour or mohair, surrounded by 10mm thick, hand-polished Karelia birchwood. To the Soviet elite, leather was just a durable material for the working driver. Wool, on the other hand, was the true standard of supreme luxury and comfort. And as these cars evolved, you can clearly see the Western design influence bleeding through. The 1958 ZIL-111 had those distinct American tail fins, and the 1967 ZIL-114 was heavily inspired by the mid-60s Chrysler Imperial. But let's be absolutely clear about one thing. These were not cheap Cadillac clones. While they totally borrowed the styling, under the hood, the engineering was completely custom-tailored for the brutal extremes of the Soviet Union. And make no mistake, Soviet leaders absolutely loved big, powerful cars. There's this famous story from a 1973 visit to the U.S., where President Richard Nixon gifted Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev a dark blue Lincoln Continental. Brezhnev immediately coaxed Nixon into the passenger seat and just took off onto the narrow perimeter roads of Camp David. He was driving over 50 miles per hour through these sharp, dangerous bends, tires squealing, completely terrifying the Secret Service, while a pale Richard Nixon literally begged him to slow down. Brezhnev's obsession with speed in cars was legendary. But, well, those playful joyrides couldn't last forever. The tone shifted dramatically in 1969. A Soviet army lieutenant actually defected and opened fire on a Kremlin motorcade targeting a ZIL-111G. He thought Brezhnev was inside, but it was actually carrying Soviet cosmonauts. The driver was mortally wounded, but he still managed to stop the car and save the passengers. This absolutely terrifying event, combined with a later 1980 request from Cuba's Raul Castro for armored vehicles, forced Soviet engineers to completely rethink their security from the ground up. The result was a total obsession with mechanical survival. They engineered some absolutely insane double redundancies into those massive 7.7-liter V8 engines. If any one system failed, the driver could instantly toggle to a backup right from the dashboard. We're talking 2 electronic ignition circuits, 2 heavy-duty 74-amp batteries wired in parallel just to survive the freezing Siberian winters, twin electric fuel pumps. They even installed this massive 21.5-liter cooling system for one specific reason, so the engine wouldn't overheat while idling for hours during those slow-speed military parades in Red Square. And to ensure the car could always escape an ambush, they utilized specialized Granite brand run-flat tires. Built with incredibly stiff sidewalls and a special internal gel, these highly exclusive tires allowed this massive, multi-ton limousine to hit escape speeds of up to 120 miles per hour, even with absolutely zero tire pressure. But the crowning achievement, the true espionage-level secret that would eventually drop the jaws of those American engineers, was the Brona Capsula, or in English, the armor capsule. This was their ultimate solution to protecting the Politburo from highly coordinated, deadly attacks. And this brilliantly illustrates the difference in thinking. You see, Western armoring companies traditionally took a finished luxury car, tore it apart, and retrofitted armored plates under the skin. But that left vulnerable seams and added a lot of top-heavy weight. Soviet engineers flipped the entire process on its head. They welded a completely rigid, self-supporting armored steel capsule first, and then literally bolted and built the car's exterior body panels around it. The results? No seams, total rigidity, and a center of gravity so incredibly low it was almost impossible to roll the vehicle. And the steel they used for this capsule? It wasn't just off the shelf. It was 68 Hg SLMH. That is a highly classified, military-grade, high-strength steel alloy. And get this, it was welded together at the Kurgan-Marsh-Zavod factory. That happens to be the exact same military plant that manufactured the Soviet BMP infantry fighting vehicles. The Politburo was quite literally riding inside a disguised tank. The windows completely matched the steel, too. They installed incredibly thick triple-layered laminated glass. In fact, Soviet brochures of the era actually claimed this glass could protect occupants from nuclear radiation. Now, historians note it could really only block minor alpha and beta particles, certainly not a full nuclear blast, but honestly, the sheer ambition of that claim tells you everything you need to know about the aura of absolute invincibility they wanted to project. But of course, all of this extreme engineering came at a heavy cost: weight. The armored ZIL-41052 weighed over 11,000 pounds. That is more than 5 tons. Because of this massive curb weight, the elite chauffeurs of the Special Purpose Garage legally had to go out and get a commercial truck license just to drive their bosses to work. And they drove them fast. Just imagine this vivid scene for a second. 5-ton vaults tearing down dedicated center lanes in Moscow, which people colloquially called the ZIL lanes, flanked by specialized ZIL Scorpion escort vehicles. These Scorpions had wide external footsteps and roof grab rails, so heavily armed bodyguards could actually stand on the outside of the speeding car, completely exposed, ready to return fire at a moment's notice. But you know, all the armor in the world couldn't protect the Soviet leadership from time itself. In the early 1980s, an aging Politburo saw leaders like Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko die in rapid succession. The ZIL factory had to quickly build these grim black station wagon variants specifically to transport their coffins through Red Square. These became such a frequent sight on television that they earned the dark nickname the Black Doctors. The end of the ZIL's reign really began with Mikhail Gorbachev. When he took power and initiated perestroika, his massive economic restructuring, he demanded modernization. ZIL engineers poured their hearts into a futuristic new prototype called the ZIL-41047. They nicknamed it Risa, and it even featured a digital voice assistant. But Gorbachev flat out rejected it. He stated that the struggling country simply no longer needed such extreme extravagance. Let's move forward and see how this builds, because following the total collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin famously used his armored ZIL for a time. But as the country opened up to the West, Yeltsin eventually shifted the Kremlin fleet to armored Mercedes-Benz vehicles. That single shift essentially killed the ZIL passenger division, ultimately culminating in the literal demolition of the massive Likhachev plant in Moscow. Yet these vehicles still completely captivate us today. In fact, a beautifully preserved 1989 ZIL-41047 recently popped up for sale on a classic car marketplace, just quietly sitting in a garage in Columbus, Ohio. The asking price? Nearly $200,000. For a car that was once the ultimate, secretive symbol of a closed-off superpower, seeing it for sale in the American Midwest is a pretty striking twist of fate. So why does all of this matter today? Well, it matters because the ZIL isn't just an old, heavy car. It is a literal relic of an era where absolute state power was forged directly into steel, Karelia birchwood, and wool velour. It perfectly represents a time when engineering was driven not by profit margins, but by the sheer force of geopolitical theater and literal survival. And honestly, this story isn't entirely over. After serial production ceased, a tiny crew of veteran craftsmen actually assembled a handful of final cars from leftover parts as late as 2017. But more intriguingly, some of those legendary, unflippable armored capsules just quietly disappeared from the records over the years. Today, they are rumored to be sitting hidden away in the private, heavily guarded garages of global oligarchs. It really makes you wonder, right? If the Soviets were willing to disguise an actual military vault as a luxury car just to win a geopolitical staring contest, what other espionage-level engineering secrets did the Cold War bury under the guise of luxury? Thanks for joining this explainer. Keep questioning what's beneath the surface.